is wine the king of intoxicants? How has alcohol increased the creativity of writers, musicians, and other artists for centuries? And why does alcohol both reveal the truth and conceal the lies? Well, tonight you're going to get those stories and insider tips and more. If you're watching this video on the replay, please get in the comments and type the word replay. Where are you logging in from? What's in your glass? I want to hear from you. And of course, if you're here live on the live stream, get into the comments as well. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online food and wine pairing classes, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of food and wine. Now, I'm live streaming this video for the first time on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube Live, but it's based on a recorded conversation for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. I'll be jumping into the comments live as we watch it together so that I can be more active in answering your questions. I want to hear from you. What's your opinion of what we're discussing? What takeaways and tips do you have? And what do you love most about the chat? All right, before I introduce our guest, let me just say that two of you are going to win a copy of his terrific book, Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll pick two people randomly from those who contact me. Right, back to our guest. Edward Slingerland is a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, where he also holds appointments in the departments of psychology and Asian studies. Dr. Slingerland is the author of several academic monographs and edited volumes, a major translation of the Analects of Confucius, and approximately 50 book chapters, reviews, and articles in top academic journals in a wide range of fields. His first trade book, Trying Not to Try, ties together insights from early Chinese thought and modern psychological research. His second, Drunk, which we'll be covering today, targets the standard scientific view of our taste for intoxicants as an evolutionary accident, arguing instead that alcohol and other drugs have played a crucial role in helping humans to be more creative, trusting, and cooperative. And he joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome, Ted. It's great to have you here with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So the history of drunkenness that's a big topic. What drew you to the story in the first place?
I just became interested in I've had a long interest in why humans do things that are costly and don't seem to have a practical point. So I started with religion. So people engage in all sorts of strange practices. They worship invisible beings, they scarify themselves, they sit on a hard seat on their only day off and listen to a boring sermon. Why do human beings engage in this behavior? And it's especially puzzling when the costly behavior that doesn't seem to have a point is universal and ancient. So we see humans doing this everywhere and throughout history. So this is what my earlier academic work, I worked a bit on the evolutionary origins of religion. And it started to occur to me that the human use of chemical intoxicants was similar. Costly, ubiquitous, ancient, and kind of begging for an evolutionary explanation. So that's what got me into it at first.
And did it have anything on a personal level for you in terms of why you were drawn to this subject?
I like wine. So I had a personal interest, but yeah, no, it's it really, I'm drawn to these kind of I think of them as mysteries hiding in plain sight. So we just assume everywhere we go that we'll be, you visit a foreign culture, you'll be welcomed in some sort of banquet, and intoxicants will be passed around. That should puzzle us more than it does, given some of the costs of alcohol use. So it's I had a personal interest in it, but it came naturally out of my academic interest.
Okay. Why don't you think we're puzzled by it? Do we just take it for granted because it's centuries of tradition?
Yeah, I think that's it. It's like religion. We've been doing it forever, everywhere. So we don't question these things that that humans naturally do. But every once in a while, it's good to step back and put on your evolutionary eyeglasses and look at something that doesn't seem puzzling and think about why why it might be puzzling and why we might need to explain it.
Absolutely. I'll have to order my evolutionary eyeglasses from Amazon tomorrow.
All right, yes, you can get there on sale.
Pronte. So wine is an ancient beverage. Domesticated grapevines have been cultivated for 11,000 years, approximately. How did the desire to make alcohol change the nomadic, wandering existence of people way back then?
So the standard story, until relatively recently in archaeology, was that humans were hunter-gatherers for most of our history as a species. At some point, we discovered we could cultivate grains, and we settled down and started making bread and other grain products. And then at some point after that, someone left their sourdough starter out a bit too long, and it started to ferment. Or we noticed that the grapes that we had picked, left in a jar, started to ferment, and we discovered alcohol by accident. So the standard story is that alcohol is a result of an evolutionary accident, historical accident. In the 1950s or so, archaeologists started to wonder about these sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where you see hunter-gatherers coming together, building these enormous sites with these huge stelae carved with animals. We don't know what they were doing. Something very dramatic. We don't know what it was. They were feasting on gazelles and other kind of wild game, and they were drinking something. They had these huge vats of liquid, and we don't have direct chemical evidence from this site, but we do have it from other sites in the region. So this is 10 to 12,000 years ago. We know that they were making beer. So you have these hunter-gatherers coming together, building these monumental ritual sites and drinking beer. And that got archaeologists starting to think that maybe the story was the other way around, that actually the draw for hunter-gatherers to settle down and start cultivating crops was not bread, it was beer. So this is the so-called beer before bread hypothesis. So, and you see the same pattern when you start to look at other parts of the world. The first plants that are cultivated seem to be chosen for their psychoactive properties, not for their nutrition properties. So it seems that actually the desire to make beer and wine is what convinced us to settle down and start growing other crops. And so there's a very direct sense in which our desire to drink alcohol led to civilization. It seems to have been the main driver. So it was dramatic. This desire to make alcoholic beverages caused a dramatic change in our lifestyle as a species.
I think those people had their priorities straight. I like that theory, bread before beer, or no, wait a minute, beer before bread. Well, why was ancient beer production so dangerous back then?
Alcohol in general is dangerous. It's costly economically, so it's estimated that in ancient Sumer, up to 2/3 of their grain production was used for beer. So they're taking this nutritious substance and turning it into a low-level neurotoxin. You have people harvesting grapes that would be delicious, eaten fresh, but they're fermenting it and again turning it into something that is dangerous for the human body. Especially in Canada, there's been a lot of press lately about the dangers of alcohol and the 2 glasses of wine per day thing that's been thrown out the door. It does seem like physiologically alcohol is a net negative for human beings. So it's costly economically, it's costly physiologically. It can raise your risk of cancer, risk of liver damage. So it was this desire to settle down and start producing alcohol created some new costs for human beings. So that's the sense in which alcohol is a costly habit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to dive more into those aspects. But beer production itself was dangerous, like to make beer back then, right?
Not so much physically dangerous.
Okay.
But once we invent distillation, things get dangerous.
Okay.
It really increases the risk of the thing we're producing, and there's physical dangers of distilling alcohol. Fermentation, particularly beer fermentation itself, is not necessarily dangerous, but it's incredibly time-consuming. There were existing theories out there before I wrote my book about why we would have started consuming alcohol. And they had to do with things like there's the dirty water hypothesis. So in a lot of human cultures historically, the local groundwater is not safe to drink. And so if you ferment it, it becomes potable. So this is the idea that we started drinking beer, making wine, because that was the only thing we could drink. The problem with that theory is that you can get the same effect by just boiling water that makes it safe. And whereas fermentation of beer is just this multi-stage, really elaborate. It's actually a lot harder than wine. At least making good wine is hard. Making bad wine is pretty easy. It happens by itself, basically. So it's alcohol is a strange substance, and why we go through these elaborate steps to make it needs a functional explanation. Is part of the argument.
Right, that's where you come in. Let's stay in the past for a bit. Tell us what the Asian flushing syndrome is and why you think it developed.
So this is a mutation, actually a set of 2 mutations on different genes, and it's arisen independently at least 3 times in human history. So that suggests it's not an accident. There's something functional going on. And there's actually signals of selection pressure on these 2 genes. If you have this syndrome, especially if you have 2 copies of this mutation, drinking alcohol is unpleasant. You flush, you feel nauseous, you get heart palpitations. It makes alcohol unpleasant. And the reason this flushing syndrome plays an important role in the book is because so there's the dirty water hypothesis, these other ideas. Another thing people would say when you say, well, why do people like to drink? Is it makes us feel good. So there's the hijack, kind of pleasure hijack theory. Alcohol happens to trigger these reward networks in our brain, and so we do it just because it's pleasurable to us. The Asian flushing syndrome shows that it doesn't have to be pleasurable. In fact, genetic evolution had this option, and this set of mutations arose, we think, 7,000 to 10,000 years ago in what's now kind of the area around Shanghai, around the beginning of rice cultivation. So evolution could have made alcohol unpleasant for us, and it did in one region of the world. And yet this syndrome hasn't spread very much. If I show a map of where it is now in the world, and it really is just still in China, a little bit in Japan and Korea. So if our taste for alcohol was an evolutionary mistake, so it's a dangerous thing that happens to make us feel good, this flushing syndrome mutation should have spread throughout the entire world, and it hasn't. So to me, it signals that there's other benefits to drinking alcohol that are outweighing the costs, and that are keeping this kind of anti-alcohol pleasure gene from spreading everywhere in the world.
And do you have any hypothesis of why it started in Asia and stayed there, as opposed to spreading?
So it started around the time rice agriculture started, and the dominant theories is that it seems to be protective against tuberculosis. So it could be that you've got people living together in these dense communities, they start cultivating rice, it's wet, tuberculosis is a problem. It was protective against that. It's also protective against fungal poisoning. So another theory is they're storing grain in a damp climate, and this is adaptive for helping them deal with, kind of partially rotted rice. They can still eat it. It seems to have something specifically to do with rice cultivation.
Okay, all right. Let's get on to the prefrontal cortex, PFC. So just keep that in mind as you're listening, folks. Prefrontal cortex, PFC. It's responsible for reasoning, making decisions, maintaining social norms, and other complex cognitive functions. Why do you believe, Ted, that the PFC is the enemy of creativity?
So the PFC, if you want to think about it, is like a laser. It allows us to stay focused. Caffeine is the friend of the PFC. So anything that you do better on caffeine is a PFC task. So staying focused on a project you need to finish, doing your taxes, moving from A to B to C, resisting temptation, resisting distraction, suppressing things that part of your brain wants to do, but you know you shouldn't do. That's all PFC. And it's great. It's great that we have that. It's the reason, you know, kids are so, especially teenagers, are so dangerous, is they don't have fully developed PFCs.
Right.
It's also very strange because it's the last part of a human being to fully develop. So it really doesn't fully mature until you're in your mid-20s. So, you know, that's why 16, 17-year-olds running around are fully mature except for this really crucial part of their brain, and that's what gets them into so much trouble. So it's very, you know, obviously it evolved for a good reason, and it's the key to what make humans able to change their behavior and plan things and think abstractly. But it seems to get in the way of what psychologists sometimes call lateral thinking. So creativity, the way we tend to think of creativity, depends on seeing unusual connections, connecting things that don't obviously connect, or seeing a new possibility, you know, thinking outside the box and thinking, oh, we didn't realize we could do this. You can't have those kind of insights when the PFC is in charge. And it seems to be because it's focusing us on one place, it doesn't allow the brain to kind of relax and see new possibilities. And this is why young children have no PFC at all, which is why they can't tie their shoes or get to school on time. They get distracted. You're always kind of hurting kids, trying to get them to focus on things because they don't have a PFC.
Right.
But they're also super creative. So I look at some evidence from child psychology research that shows that like a 4 or 5-year-old kid can solve these lateral thinking tasks better than an adult can, much better. And our ability to solve these tasks goes down over time.
So we peak at 4 and then creativity-wise. Yeah.
Creativity-wise, we're at our best at about 4 or 5.
Oh, wow. What are examples of what these 4-year-olds do when they do a lateral thinking test?
They're able to, so Alison Gopnik is the person at Berkeley who's done this research. She designs these tasks where you've got to decide if something is a blicket. You know, she just makes up this word, is this a blicket? And the rules for determining if something's a blicket are really counterintuitive. You know, it's not something you would think of. It's often something very strange where you have to stack different things on top of each other and the sound goes off and that makes it a blicket. It's not, adults are just, we don't think that flexibly. So we're trying normal things like, you know, is it this color? We're thinking in terms of patterns of problem solving that we use in our everyday lives that we're used to. Kids are not constrained by that. They can just think of crazy combinations of things that might be a blicket. So they're really good at this kind of divergent thinking. And we just get worse and worse as we age, just basically kind of linear decline until we hit 25. So.
Wow, okay. Wow, peaking at 4. Okay, so you note that traditionally wine has, or traditionally in the past, it had much lower alcohol on average, 8 to 10%. Today, of course, you know, if we get a Shiraz from the Barossa Valley, it can be 15, 16%. Beer also was low in alcohol, 3, 4% versus maybe say 5, 6% today. Do you believe, therefore, there should be different legal minimum ages for the consumption of wine and beer versus spirits?
Yeah, so for most of our history, we've been drinking only beer and wine, right? Just naturally fermented beverages. And one of my arguments in the book is that this was a safety feature. So alcohol's got some dangers, but it always came with the safety. One safety feature was the limits of natural fermentation. So historically, you know, beers we'd be drinking 2 to 3% ABV, and fruit wines maybe 5 or 6. We've been relentlessly pushing yeast to get tougher and tougher for tens of thousands of years, right? There's selective
super yeasts.
Super yeast. I read an article relatively recently about sake yeast that there's evidence of selection pressure going back like 10,000 years, so a very long time. So we've been pushing the limits of natural fermentation for as long as we've been making alcohol. But we run up against the wall. So the max we seem to be able to get is these crazy, powerful wines from Australia. That means that there's a limit to how dangerous beer and wine can be. even though they're much stronger than they historically have been, it's within the same ballpark.
Sure.
Once we figure out distillation, we take that safety feature off because we figure out a way to pull off the alcohol and just keep pulling off the alcohol. We can get 90-something% ABV liquors. This is a very recent development, so this surprised me. I don't know, I always thought we kind of always had distilled liquors. This is a recent invention.
How
So
recent?
In the West, not until the 1600s.
Okay.
In terms of on a large enough scale that people would have access to distilled liquor.
Okay.
The principle of it was understood a long time ago. Aristotle wrote about it. But it's very hard. This is where the danger and technical challenges come in. It's very hard to pull off distillation on a large scale unless you know metallurgy and glass blowing. You have to be able to keep liquids at a very precise temperature for a long period of time. It's actually technically quite difficult. So it wasn't until the 1600s in Europe and probably maybe a couple hundred years earlier in China that distilled liquors were available on a large scale. So your average person could drink gin or whatever. And this completely changes things because once we have alcohol in a super potent form, it overwhelms our system. So we have these mechanisms that we've inherited from primate ancestors who started eating partially fermented fruit on the forest floor. We have these mechanisms to detoxify ethanol, and they work at kind of natural fermentation levels. Once you start doing shots of a 90-something% distilled liquor, it just completely overwhelms your body's defenses, and you can go from being sober to being really dangerously drunk in 10 or 15 minutes.
Wow.
So distilled liquors are really a game changer and represent a different level of risk for human beings. Whereas the traditional beers, let's say that we drank 2 to 3%, if you're a large person and you're eating some food, you could drink those all day long and never. Most of the benefits that I talk about for alcohol mostly come at about 0.08 blood alcohol content.
Okay.
And if you're drinking a low ABV beer or a milder wine, you can kind of sip that all day long and not really ever get beyond that sweet spot. But distilled liquor is much more dangerous. So I really think, and this is the case in some European countries, that distilled liquor, even though it's just ethanol, it's the same drug technically as beer and wine. It should be regulated differently. It should be treated as a much more dangerous drug. And so, my daughter, I've raised her in kind of the more southern European lifestyle where she got introduced to wine very early. You give her a little bit watered down. And when she got older into her teens, I'd let her sip a little wine. And she's actually developed a quite good palate. She doesn't have quite the vocabulary, but she definitely can discriminate tastes in wine. I think that's healthy and normal. It helps encourage a sense that wine or beer is part of a meal. It's part of a normal thing human beings do. But I've always been very clear with her that distilled liquors are something she shouldn't do until that part of her brain is fully developed. So
do you think that? Go ahead.
I don't think people should be allowed to drink distilled liquor until their 20s, well into their 20s.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I agree. And even the distribution should be, I think, not at the corner store.
Yeah.
Although I'm an advocate of privatization of the liquor boards across Canada, it's like that seems like to be in a different category.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So why do you think then that wine is the king of intoxicants, as you call it? What makes it better than all the rest?
Yeah. So not necessarily wine in particular, but alcohol for sure is the king of intoxicants.
Okay.
And it's because no other drug that we've discovered does all the same things. In the book I talk about 2 other possible candidates. So cannabis we've had for a very long time. We've been cultivating that for probably at least 6,000 years. And that's got advantages over alcohol. It's less physiologically harmful, so it doesn't seem to harm your body as much as ethanol does. And it's not physically addictive. It can be psychologically addictive, but it's not physically addictive the way alcohol is. But we don't see cannabis used socially, historically. We don't see it as widespread as alcohol. And that's because it's got two main flaws. It's hard to dose. So if you're smoking it, you have to know how to hold it in your lungs. And different people are going to get different doses depending on how they do that. Whereas you don't have to teach someone how to drink a beer. They just drink it, and it's pretty natural. If you take it in an edible form, especially as people have access to legal cannabis and gummies have discovered, the onset is so long that it's really hard to dose. You'll take some, 2 hours later, nothing's happening, take some more, and then you're like, whoa, that's way too much. So it's hard to dose. It also has really variable effects on different people. So I have friends who smoke cannabis and then want to talk about philosophy or go dancing, or it makes them very social and active. I've tried every variety of cannabis that exists, and without fail, it makes me super paranoid, and then I fall asleep. It's a terrible social drug for me. And so the drug that you use culturally to help people come together, to get them to cooperate, to get them to trust one another, it can't be something that has really variable effects in all of them. If some of them are falling asleep and some of them want to dance, that's no good.
That's not a dinner party kind of.
Not a dinner party kind of vibe, right? You don't want to go have a business meeting where everyone's smoking cannabis and having these different experiences. So the nice thing about alcohol is it's easy to dose. It has very predictable effects across people. So that's its big advantage over cannabis. And then we've also, for a very long time, had access to psychedelics of various kinds. So mushrooms, various plants that are hallucinogens. The problem with those, they're physically not as dangerous as alcohol, actually. Physiologically, psilocybin is safer than alcohol. Also not physically addictive, which is great.
Okay.
But they, again, imagine, the new neighbors move in and you invite them over for some psilocybin mushrooms. It just would go really weird, right? It so disassociates you from reality, and for such a long time that it's pretty useless as a social drug. Historically, it's typically been used either, if it's used by everyone in the society, it's used once or twice a year at a very special event where you block off a day or two for it, or it's used by a special class of people. So shamans or priests use it as a way to communicate with the spirit world or whatever, but you don't use it as an everyday social drug. So we haven't discovered anything. If you were a cultural engineer and you wanted to invent a drug, it's got to be super easy to discover, easy to make. It needs to have predictable effects on people, easy to dose, very short half-life. So it has to have an effect on you, but then an hour or 2 hours later, you're perfectly fine. Ideally, it should pair nicely with food. It's beer and wine.
Absolutely.
So,
it's a great engineering team that put that together. Yeah, that's great. And so how does alcohol downregulate or slow down the PFC? What's actually happening as we drink to our PFC?
Alcohol has been compared to a pharmacological hand grenade. This is Stephen Brown, the journalist, called it that. Unlike cocaine or LSD, which go in and very kind of surgically target one part of the brain, ethanol just kind of goes in as like a kid hitting a piano. It's just doing all these different things at once. It's both we tend to think of it as a depressant, but it's actually a stimulant as well. So it's stimulating. One thing it's stimulating is these pro-social chemicals in our body. So serotonin, endorphin, these things that make us feel expansive and kind of feel good about ourselves and more kindly disposed to other people. So it's stimulating that, but then it's simultaneously depressing certain brain regions. And one of the first brain regions it goes after is the PFC. So its main effect, and the effect that I think is really one of the functions that we're going after with ethanol, is it's turning the PFC down.
Okay.
So as adults, we have this fully functioning PFC that's great. I think that alcohol is a tool we've invented to, when we need to, temporarily turn it back down a few notches and get a little bit back to being more like a 4 or 5-year-old in terms of our creativity and trustingness and sociality. So that's one of the main effects, is it's really just depressing the function of the prefrontal cortex.
So our PFC isn't making connections as fast. It's not worried about what's in front of us. It's just going like kind of laying back on the couch, or.
Yeah, it's the way I think the analogy I used at one point is the playground monitor is gone. So
I like
the
that.
PFC is not there telling you got to do ABC. It's taking a nap, or it's left for a lunch break, and now different parts of the brain are allowed to talk to each other, and these feel-good chemicals are allowed to start, making you more cooperative and friendly and social.
And if different parts of the brain are starting to talk to each other, there's your lateral thinking, your creativity. Is there one part of the brain that is most associated with creativity, or is it many connections, the lateral ability?
It's the connections, yeah. It's
Okay.
not so much a region. It's the ability of different regions to talk to each other.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned that creativity peaks around 0.008% alcohol, which is when we shouldn't drive, but we should write or do a sonata or whatever, I guess. Wow. And then is there, like, when do we go out of that zone? Like, when is it too much and everything just becomes sloppy and blurry?
Yeah. When you get to about 0.2, once your motor, so the motor cortex eventually gets depressed by alcohol. Once you've reached that level, it's no good anymore. So once you start slurring your words, you start stumbling, that's when your BAC has gotten to a point that it's targeting now your motor cortex.
All right. That's the part where my tasting notes become,
Yeah, exactly. You're just like,
this is great.
Good. Yeah. So
what is BAC?
Blood alcohol content.
Oh, okay.
So,
Gotcha.
Yeah. So 0.08's in most jurisdictions around where you should stop operating motor vehicles.
Okay.
And that seems to be about where you kind of get the maximal kind of creativity, sociality, and you go much beyond that, and just stupid, dangerous things start to happen. So.
Right. Okay. And is this state, that downregulated PFC, is it different or similar to a runner's high, those endorphins that kick in after a long run?
Yeah, it's very similar.
Okay.
It's physiologically, in many ways, the same state. So the runner's high occurs because you're taxing your body so much that it needs to start shutting stuff down. It doesn't have enough. It doesn't have the luxury to run everything. You kind of think about if you have a backup generator and the power goes out, you're not going to power your hot tub anymore. You're going to focus on the things you really need, the lights, the refrigerator. When the body's stressed, it says, okay, what do we not need anymore? And the PFC is the first thing it looks at, because it's physiologically pretty expensive, and it's the most evolutionarily novel part of the brain. So it targets that first. And so you get the PFC downregulation, and you also get the body producing endorphins and other things that it does when it exercises and is stressed. So that runner's high is actually very similar physiologically to the way you feel after a glass or two of wine. And you can also get there, I talk in the book about the fact that religious traditions that ban chemical intoxicants for whatever reason often substitute other practices to get you there. Singing and dancing all night.
Right. The whirling dervishes, who get ecstasy,
exactly.
or whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's very similar to the runner's high. So you're getting people to stress their bodies through sleep deprivation or starvation. You fast. You can get into a very similar state of mind as you do with alcohol.
Maybe even the self-flagellation. That's like I'm no longer a Catholic, but that's
absolutely.
whipping yourself. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, pain, because pain will do it. Pain will have the same effect.
Okay.
So there are other ways to get to that same state besides alcohol.
Meditation probably as well, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, meditation, because you're almost trying to use your mind to shut your mind down. You're trying to use your breathing and posture to almost deliberately shut down the PFC. Right. But that's really hard to do, which is why most people find meditation very difficult.
Right, because you're conscious of what you're conscious of and going around in circles. But what about when you're in a flow state as a writer? That seems like you're really focused. Is that more on the caffeine side of things and less? Is your PFC operating and you lose awareness of your surroundings? Is similar or different?
That's similar.
It is.
Being in the zone in any way is similar. And as a writer, you can get there. I mean, as I discussed in the book, a good way to get there is a glass or two of wine. There's a reason that historically we've associated alcohol with artists and poets and creative types, because there's good evidence that it enhances creativity. But again, you can get there just through, in a way, it's like the runner's high. It's pain. So you're working on something really hard. You're stressing your brain out. You're fatiguing your brain in the same way you fatigue it when you go long distance running.
True.
And then it just kind of goes, all right, and relaxes. Ideally, this can happen. And then you start to get creative insights. So that's another way to do it, is just kind of stressing your mind in the same way you would stress your body, exercise-wise, can get you into that flow state.
I love that explanation. I've never been able to figure it out. That's great. So yeah, you mentioned writers, musicians, and so on. I don't know that he said it, but there's a quote attributed to Ernest Hemingway that says, "Write drunk, edit sober." What's your take on that? Are you in agreement or up to a point?
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, because you need both, right? You need to generate lots of options, and that's what alcohol helps you do. So you can think of new things that you hadn't thought of before.
Yeah.
But then you need the PFC to come in and be the parent. It's like the kid drawing all this crazy stuff, and then the parent has to come in and say, okay, this is the one I want to hang on my wall. This other stuff is terrible. Your brain can generate all these options when you're on alcohol, but then you need the PFC and kind of your grown-up PFC brain to decide what's good and what's not, or how to reshape the raw good stuff that the non-PFC self created.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's really good advice.
You took your own advice, or you did not at first, but tell us about writing your book proposal for Drunk.
Yeah. So this is not in the book. It's something I talked about in some interviews, and I should have put it in the book because it's
kind of meta.
It's very meta. I wrote like, at this point, 10 or 12 versions of the book proposal, and my agent kept sending it back to me and saying, bah, it's not good. she's Manhattanite, and she's not very
blunt.
She's pretty blunt. She's like, I'm not sending this out, and she was right. Like, there's something missing, and it was hard to figure out what it was, because all the arguments were there, all the science was there. But it was basically like it was PFC written A to B to C. So why do people like to drink? Well, some people think this reason. That doesn't make any sense. So let's look at why it's puzzling. And then I walked through all the arguments were there, but in this very kind of linear fashion that was a little boring. And I realized after she rejected like the 12th version that I hadn't taken my own advice in the book, which was write drunk. You can edit sober later, but do a little drunk writing first. And I was this was pre-COVID, I was on this conference trip, and I had a couple hours before my first meeting, and I was having dinner with my colleagues, and so I went down to the hotel bar with my laptop and stared at the screen, and what's now the first 2 pages of the book, it felt like it was revealing itself to me. I didn't feel like I was writing it. I just felt like I was taking dictation. and that everyone loves. Everyone loves the first pages of the book. Those were the products of zero point .08 at least, maybe 0.1 BAC. It was a Negroni and a third. So that's where I produced that, and that's what I think sold the book proposal, and it's people's favorite thing about the final product. And I don't think I would have been able to write those things unless I had just relaxed my mind. And instead of doing the A, B, C, here's my argument writing, I came up with something punchy that would grab people's attention. So yeah, I use this practically in my work.
I listened to your book and really enjoyed it, but remind me of, if you can recall by heart, the first sentence or two. Do you remember?
People like to masturbate.
Right.
People like to masturbate. That just came to me. I was like, oh, that's how I'm going to start the book.
It's definitely a Negroni or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They also like to do shots of Jägermeister and eat Twinkies. Not necessarily all at the same time, but that's up to personal preference. So those are the first two lines.
That'll draw you in, yeah.
That'll draw you in. And that was, again, not something I think I could have ever written just completely on caffeine. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, it's not a dry treatise after that.
Right.
So tell us, you have a couple of other stories that are interesting. Tell us about the time when you were a student covering for your professor who was away. You were delivering a lecture for the first time, or early on, to undergraduate students, a class. What happened then?
I was a grad student. I had been TAing in this class, so I was just a teaching assistant, but my professor was out of town. He's like, why don't you do this lecture? And this was 150, maybe 200 person lecture class, and I was nervous because I'd never spoken to that many people before. And I don't know who it was. I think it might have been one of my fellow grad students. Was like, you need to take the edge off. And so this was back in the day. Most people won't remember this. Back in film photography. Film came in these little plastic canisters. So I had this little plastic film canister, and I put a little bit of vodka in it. And before I went out to give my lecture at 10:30 a.m. or whatever it was, I did a little shot of vodka. And it may have just been psychosomatic because it was so small amount, but it seemed to kind of just take the edge off and get me over that hump at the beginning. There's something about the beginning when you start talking to a big group of people. At least back then. Now I've done it so much, I'm kind of used to it. But it got me over that initial nervousness and launched me into the material enough that then I just kind of let the material do its thing. So then I was kind of going.
You're good to go.
But it helps with that kind of initial PFC getting in the way.
Nervousness, yeah, definitely. Especially the start of anything, that inertia of getting going. Tell us about let's stick with the university themes. How did a huge research collaboration happen, mainly because the University of British Columbia finally got a pub on campus?
Yeah. So this was a while ago now, but there was no place for faculty or grown-ups to drink. There was like a student pub. And then they built a pub at the bus loop. So it was perfect. It was actually kind of where we all went through to get on the bus and go home anyway. And so a group of us started meeting on Friday afternoons. And all different departments, very different backgrounds, but we were interested in religion. We all kind of from different directions were interested in religion. And it created, sitting around drinking a beer to having some nachos, just created a space where we could talk about things in a way we never could if we were in a coffee shop or we were in somebody's office. And it led to this $3 million grant from SSHRC, from Social Science Humanities Research Council, on the evolution of religion. And I honestly believe that grant would have never happened without a place to drink beer. Because it gives you, so one of my arguments in the book is it enhances individual creativity. So as an individual, you're more creative. But because it's reducing inhibitions, it also enhances group creativity, because now you're not only more creative, but you're less nervous about saying something.
Right.
So something where your PFC would normally say, "Oh, don't say that, it's too crazy," you'll just blurt out, and maybe it actually is a great idea. So there's a double effect. It's enhancing individual creativity, reducing inhibitions. And I look at this study by an economist that takes advantage. It's a great correlational study. Took advantage of the fact that prohibition in the U.S. was imposed at the county level over a very long period of time. So it's kind of a nice natural experiment. What happens when people can't drink socially anymore? And what he found, he was using, he had data on patent applications at the county level, and he was using that as a proxy for group innovation. And what he found is if you take a wet county and you impose prohibition on it, patent applications nosedived.
Wow.
And didn't come back for about another 3 years. And he thinks the recovery is because people figured out speakeasies. They figured out workarounds to drink socially again.
Right.
So this is I think one of the main functions of alcohol is this kind of brainstorming, group innovation.
Absolutely. Sounds a whole lot more fun than the team-enforced improv sessions.
Yeah, right. So that is
yes,
another possible way. That's another possible way to do it. But it's not. It's kind of not as fun.
No.
and it's harder. It's much more of a hassle.
Absolutely.
But no, you can get the same effect through this is why people are worried about alcohol in the workplace, right? And so we come up with other ways. Let's do an escape room.
No, rafting.
And those aren't crazy ideas, because they can have the same effect, right? The physical danger or kind of getting lost in a game can downregulate your PFC, it can boost endorphins, it could have the same effect. But yeah, I hate escape rooms. I'd much rather just have a cocktail reception.
You have to get hide a Mickey or take in some film roll again or something. I know, me too. And then tell us about the tour you took at Google with the engineers there of their campus, and especially the Whiskey Room and the Bomber Peak.
Yeah, so this was when I was giving talks on trying not to try, and this is where I got interested in the alcohol thing from another angle, besides the kind of origins of civilization. And I got interested in the creativity problem of how alcohol is helping us to think in a flexible way, and how hard that is to consciously will yourself to be creative. So my first trade book is called Trying Not to Try, and it's about this paradox that if you try to be funny, you're not funny. If you try to be creative, you're not going to be creative. The early Chinese philosophers I look at come up with various tricks to get you around that, which are kind of like the escape room thing, giving you things to do that make you stop thinking about it. But there's a story in one of these Taoist texts where they compare being in the state of spontaneity to being drunk. And this kind of light went on for me, and I was like, oh, maybe alcohol is this cultural technology we invented to get around this tension of trying to use your own mind to shut your mind down. So I was talking about that, and I mentioned this study, the only study, actually to date, that's directly looking at alcohol and creativity, that's where they found the 0.08 peak for creativity. And afterwards in the Q&A, their hand shot up and they were like, have you ever heard of the Balmer Peak? And I hadn't, and it's possibly apocryphal, but supposedly Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft, discovered this blood alcohol content level where he was a supernaturally good coder. And he would hook himself up to an alcohol IV to keep himself at exactly that BAC so he could code. And yeah, I find that implausible.
Taking the fun out of it, though.
Yeah, taking the fun out of it, too.
So it's very mechanical or whatever.
It's very computer engineer approach to it. So that's where I heard about the Balmer Peak, which is the same idea, right? You get this creativity boost. And then they took me on a tour of the campus, and they said, "We know where we're taking you first," and they took me to their whiskey room. So when they run into a problem as an engineering team, and they just can't, they're drinking caffeine, they're doing ABC reasoning, they're really trying as hard as they can, and they're just not solving the problem, they don't keep doing that. They stop, and they go to this room where they've got amazing, I was very jealous, they have an amazing collection of single malt scotches.
Wow.
And, beanbag chairs and a foosball table. And they just go and they have a little bit of scotch, and they have some whiteboards, and they turn down their PFCs a bit, turn down their inhibitions a bit, and they say that's often where they get the breakthrough they need to go back, then do caffeine again and go back to work.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting. To me, it was really revealing that a company like Google that is completely dependent on creativity, right? That's their product in a way. Actually, institutionally makes room for alcohol, right? They sanction this room because they know that it actually, in the end, is a good thing for their creativity.
I wonder if they studied the number of problems if people started reporting,
you can see them.
I'm really stuck on this line of code, let's go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and they care about the bottom line, right? They're not going to do this just because it's fun.
Right.
So that's to me, that's a bit of evidence that successful organizations are aware of this benefit.
Absolutely. And, you've mentioned it briefly, but how does alcohol, especially for those who are, say, doing a business transaction, increase the trust? So it's regulating the PFC. What else is happening?
So trust issues are a big thing in large-scale societies. And back in our old lifestyle, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, trust wasn't quite as important because we were interacting mostly with relatives, people we were physically related to, or people we knew really well. Once we move into large-scale societies, we're constantly faced with these situations where we have to trust people who are strangers. And often we're trusting people who are strangers who we're never going to see again. We've never seen them before, we're never going to see them again. So you get a class of trust problem that economists call the prisoner's dilemma. It goes by various names. Prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons is a version of this, where self-interested, selfish people are going to get a suboptimal outcome. If I pursue my selfish interest, you pursue your selfish interest, we're worse off. We're actually going to be better off if we trust each other, we cooperate. We'll both actually in the end do better selfishly. We'll get a better payoff individually. The catch is that we have to trust each other, because if you cheat and I cooperate, I get a really terrible payoff.
Right.
So there are millions, it sounds very kind of abstruse, but these happen all the time. When I agree to help you move your couch, we're in a prisoner's dilemma situation, right? Because we all are better off if large objects that one person can't move, people agree to help other people. We all get a better payoff. But if I agree to move your couch, and then when I need to move my couch, you're sick or you have some other, you defect on me, I've just put out a lot of effort and gotten no benefit back. In reality, so economists are puzzled, really interested in the prisoner's dilemma, because rational agents can't solve it. So rational, self-interested agents are selfish and just don't cooperate and get suboptimal. No one helps anyone move couches. Everyone just kind of stays by themselves. In fact, we don't do that, and it seems to be because we trust each other. We actually, and what binds us together is things like loyalty and duty and love. I'm not feeling well, and you call me and say you need your couch moved. I'm like, oh, okay, she's my friend, right? This kind of the bond you feel to other people is what allows this cooperation to happen. The danger, of course, is if someone can fake those feelings. So emotions are what allows us to be cooperative. but there's a danger that people could fake emotions. So if you fake being a really good friend, I'll do all these things for you, and then you're conveniently busy when I need you. And so humans have also developed this amazing ability to read facial expressions and body language and smiles. So I show a picture in the book of a Duchenne versus a non-Duchenne smile. So a sincere smile you make when you're really amused versus a smile you make when you smile for a picture. They're completely different muscle systems. They look completely differently. And that's because one is under conscious control and the other one's not, at least for most people. It's hard to fake a genuine smile.
Right.
So we're constantly looking at signs of trustworthiness in other people. Cultures have an interest in helping us do that well. They want to get rid of cheaters. And so one of my arguments is this, again, is where alcohol comes in as a cultural technology. If I'm worried, I'm going to meet you and decide if we're going to have a treaty together or if I'm going to agree to move your couch. If we have a couple glasses of wine while we're talking about that, I'm downregulating your PFC, so I'm making it harder for you to fake, making it harder for you to lie. If you think about it, lying is a very PFC dependent thing, because I have to keep in mind, if I'm lying to you about my real intentions, I have to keep in mind both what I'm telling you is true and what I know is true. I have to keep my emotional and facial expressions completely separate. I have to fake ones that are consonant with what I told you and suppress ones that don't relate to what I told you. And that's really PFC heavy. So one way to think of it is when we get together, we have a couple glasses of wine in a situation where we potentially need to trust each other or have differing interests. I compare it to shaking hands. So we shake hands to show that we're not carrying a weapon in our dominant hand. In the same way, we drink a couple glasses of wine, we're taking our PFC out and putting it on the table and saying, I'm now cognitively disarmed. I am much less capable of lying than I was half an hour ago. And also, so that's kind of intuitive. It's harder to lie when you're drinking alcohol. We're also better at detecting lies when we're drinking alcohol, because we're better at detecting lies when we're not trying. We think we know what the signs are of lying, but we don't. We do a much better job when we just relax and kind of let our unconscious figure it out.
So alcohol helps both ways. It helps
both ways, yeah.
Oh, okay, I got that. I was mistaken in that, and I'll correct that. But so it's harder to lie, but it's easier to tell when someone is lying under the influence. Okay.
Yeah, we're actually better at it when we're not trying consciously.
Okay.
And then on top of that, it makes us less inclined to lie, because in addition to impairing our PFC, it's boosting serotonin, endorphins, these things that make us more pro-social. And there's for all these things I look at experimental evidence, and there's good experimental evidence that you shoot serotonin up someone's nose and they cheat less in the economic games. So we feel better about other people, and so we're less inclined to try to cheat them. So this is why, again, across the world throughout history, anytime you get people coming together where they have potentially different interests or they need to learn to trust each other, the alcohol comes out.
Right.
Because it's this really important tool for enhancing trust and cooperation.
And there's so many rituals. I mean, we always hear about them, whether it's in China or wherever abroad, there's, toasts and a protocol and rituals, but it's also a ritual way of getting drunk together often, because they at least traditionally drank to excess.
Yes.
But
yes.
Wow, time's flying. So I just want to make sure we hit a lot of these points that I wanted to make sure of. So I think you've noted in the past that about 15% of the population is prone to alcoholism. Why did a larger percentage of that drink excessively during the pandemic?
So alcohols historically come with two safety features. One is the one we talked about, natural fermentation, right? And we then remove that by inventing distilled liquors. The other one is social helps, ritual practices. alcohol historically, to have private access to alcohol is historically unprecedented. Every culture I know of throughout history, you only drink in public with other people, and you typically don't even have private access to alcohol in your home. It's something that's done in public with other people. When you're doing that, the culture can regulate your drinking. And again, historically, you see all these different ways we do that. So in ancient Greece, the symposium, the wine drinking party, was hosted by the symposiarch. That was a person in charge. They were in charge of passing around the wine when it was time to drink. They were in charge of watering it down. So the Greeks didn't drink their wine straight, they watered it down. And if things were going a little sluggish, maybe they would put a little less water in and get things going. If things were getting out of hand, they would water it down a bit more, or they would wait, a couple more minutes before they passed it around again. So you did not even have personal control over how much you drank. It was determined by the host. And you see a very similar structure in China. And this is really true today, and even today in more formal situations. You don't drink at will. You have a little shot glass at your side, and then when it's time for a toast, it gets filled, and you gambe, and you shoot it, and everyone drinks. Who can toast is ritually regulated. It's not just anyone can do it, typically. That's another way to control drinking. So I decide at what pace we're all going to drink as a group. Even in very informal situations, like going to a pub together with some friends, you typically order in rounds. So, if I have a problem with alcohol and I drink my beer really quickly and I want another one, I've got to wait until everyone else finishes and we order another round. So we have all these ways of regulating each other's drinking when we're doing it socially, which is the way we've always done it. What's new about modern industrial societies is you can have alcohol in your house and drink as much of it as you want, which is kind of crazy.
It's true.
You can have, I have a liquor cabinet at home in Vancouver that has enough alcohol in it to kill a small village. And there's no one there telling me how much I can drink.
Right.
And then imagine, the pandemic suddenly, we can't even go out and do it socially anymore. We're stuck in our houses.
Right.
And so there's really good data that problem drinking went through the roof during the pandemic because we still have access to distilled liquors, these very addictive, powerful forms of alcohol, and the normal social norms around drinking are gone because we can't drink in public anymore. It was crazy. I was traveling back and forth between Canada and the U.S. My partner's here in the U.S., and I was the only one who could travel because I have passports on both sides. And when I came back to Vancouver each time, I had to quarantine for 2 weeks. I had to be alone in my apartment. I couldn't leave my apartment.
Wow.
But I could call up my local taqueria, and in addition to bringing me some pulled pork, they could deliver me a case of tequila if I wanted it. So that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
You're alone in your house, but you can have as much alcohol as you want. Humans are not designed for that.
Right. Absolutely. Do you know if it recalibrated after the pandemic? Like, has it gone back to pre-pandemic levels?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
And it's because it's really hard to go down again.
Right.
Because of the addictive quality of alcohol, once you up your consumption, it really takes a conscious effort to bring it back down again. So I think, I'm not sure what the current data is on that, but I think we still are in the kind of aftermath of this excessive drinking that happened during the pandemic.
That's what I hear as well, that it hasn't recalibrated. What was the most surprising insight you discovered while writing the book, Drunk?
I was surprised about the distillation thing.
Okay.
I had always assumed that we always had access to liquor. And discovering that it really was pretty historic, in a story that goes back 10 million years to our primate ancestors who adapted to eating fermenting fruit. Something that happened in the 1600s is like yesterday. It's really, really recent.
When you have your perspective, sure.
Yeah, it's a blink of an eye.
Right.
And so that was really surprising to me, that
Yeah.
that alcohol is so recent, that distilled liquor is such a recent discovery. And the whole beer before bread thing is something I didn't know about before I
Right.
started doing the research. The fact that it does seem like the desire to make fermented beverages is what started agriculture. That was new and really interesting.
That is big. Is there anything that you've discovered since then that would go into a new edition or another book on a related topic?
In the end, last chapter, I talk about the dangers of alcohol and kind of how we have to recognize that it's got these dangers, but also if we see the benefits, we can make intelligent decisions about how to use it. I wish all the stuff that has happened in Canada around, Health Canada and the, only safe level is, well, there's no safe level, and we recommend you should have 2 drinks per week. I wish that had happened in time for me to address in the book.
To address it.
Because I think it's a classic example of how our public policy around alcohol is completely distorted by this medicalized lens, where we look at everything through just risk mitigation and don't take into account any of the benefits, including pleasure, which should be in
Right.
the mix, but these other benefits, social, mental health, creativity.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the latest Health Canada guidance on this is absolutely nuts, and I wish I could have had a chance to address it in the book.
It is nuts. I'll just add there, only because I've been researching and writing about it recently, Ted. Health Canada hasn't changed its guidelines since 2011, but the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse, which is not government run, came out with that study that scared the
Right.
heck out of everybody, that said no level. So did the World Health Organization. So these are scary headlines, but they also ignore the J curve on
Right.
regular alcohol, not distilled, but that there are actually still health benefits in moderation. But
Right.
I'm biased too, so I read the
Yeah.
studies I want. But
Yeah, but I also don't think we should. I don't think that's where the hill we want to defend
right,
is a physiological thing, because
right,
even if it turns out, which could be the case, that it's a net physiological negative. I think it's been a mistake for people defending moderate alcohol use to play their game, to play the physiology medical game, because that's not the right game. We have to, in the same way that driving. What if we took the same attitude toward driving
and
cars,
flying.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Flying,
it's all
whatever.
dangerous.
It's
Yeah.
all dangerous,
Could
right?
kill us.
So it can
Yeah.
kill us, but we still do it. So
Yeah.
if all we cared about was maximizing our lifespan and risk mitigation, we should wrap ourselves up in bubble wrap and never leave our apartment, right? Because it's dangerous
You're right.
out there. But that would be miserable existence. And so I think it's a mistake to play the medical game.
Yeah,
I think you need to change the conversation and say, look, let's just, figure out what the physiological risks are, but also have the kind of decision-making process we use with anything else, which is if we want to have a happy, successful, well-rounded life, what's the role of this substance in our lives? And I think that one of the reasons I wrote Drunk is because I think public policy and public debate on this is really stunted.
Yes.
We don't have the big picture, and so what I'm trying to do is, through history and anthropology and archaeology and modern psychological science, explain what the big picture is, and then we may still say, no, it's too dangerous, but at least then we'll be making an informed, intelligent decision, and I just don't think that's been the case so far.
Well said. Well put. All right, so I just want to wrap up a little bit with a few questions to end off here. In the Museum of Ted Slingerland, which 3 objects would be in the central display?
Yeah, that's really hard. Maybe a kayak paddle. Kayaking is one of my passions.
Okay.
A wine glass.
Some
nice
wine, yes.
Glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a book. Those are
And a
kind of
book.
my 3 favorite things to do, probably.
Awesome. And if you could share a bottle of wine with anyone in the world, living or dead, Who would it be?
Probably Zhuangzi, who is this early Taoist thinker, who no one knows about, which is a shame.
Right.
One of my trade books is going to be introducing people to Zhuangzi. He's a really fascinating, incredibly creative thinker in the Warring States period in China. He's the one who had the analogy about the sage as like a drunken person. So, yeah, I would like to meet him.
And what would you drink with him?
I would drink just a mind-blowing wine that... There are wines I've had in the past that have made me just think life would be really sad without the substance. Like, I guess off the top of my head, Silex, the Didier Daigneault, that the Loire Sauvignon Blanc. I had an experience drinking that in like the early 2000s where I just, it was a religious experience.
Oh wow, is that Loire Valley?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really, he was kind of one of the innovators in small, biodynamic, small crops, and just these wines have a just power, depth, and clarity that it really is it's artistically beautiful. So something like that, I feel like Zhuangzi would appreciate.
Wow. And is there any question you've never been asked but would like to be asked?
I've been asked every question you could imagine. I've done probably 150 podcasts.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
Okay, so you have been asked them all. Your favorite question then would you like a top up?
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, it's been great too, and actually, I wish it's a shame I couldn't kind of go back and rewrite the book because I've been asked so many great questions.
Yeah,
oh yeah,
sure.
I should have said something about that.
You have to have a sequel or a follow up. How can people best get in touch with you online and find your books and everything else, Ted?
I have a website, so just edwardslingerland.com, and it's got everything.
It's got everything. Okay, cool, great. Well, thank you. Please don't log off just yet, but thank you for this. It's fascinating. I could talk for hours, but we probably need to get wine sooner or later.
Yes,
Enough PFC for now. But thank you, Ted. I wish you all the best, and hopefully next time it will be over wine.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, cheers.